The ballroom glowed with crystal chandeliers, their light spilling across tables draped in ivory linen. New York's elite drifted through the space, voices low and elegant, every detail rehearsed to perfection. Yet, in the kitchen just beyond the gilded doors, sweat poured from the forehead of Daniel Hayes. This was not just another catering job, it was the stage upon which his entire career would either rise to glory or collapse into ruin. Before diving into Daniel's dark tale, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more gripping stories like this one. Stories that unravel ambition, betrayal, and redemption in ways that stay with you long after they end. Daniel stood over the cutting board, his knife moving with a precision born from decades of repetition. Still, his hand trembled ever so slightly. He was a man in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with streaks of grey cutting through his dark hair. His presence commanded respect, but behind his steady gaze lived shadows of doubt. Every dish he plated tonight was meant to silence those doubts, to declare that the boy who once grew up in a modest Charleston kitchen had finally conquered the glittering towers of Manhattan. For years, Daniel had worked his way up, enduring ridicule from chefs who dismissed his southern background as rustic and unrefined. Now, with the Morton family's wedding banquet, he was expected to craft an evening that would be remembered not just for the vows exchanged, but for the feast itself. Journalists had been invited. Influential donors and politicians filled the guest list. Even rival chefs, those who once sneered at him, were said to be in attendance. Success tonight meant sealing his place among the legends. Failure meant humiliation on a stage far larger than he'd ever faced. He adjusted the cuffs of his chef's coat, crisp and white, yet already damp from the heat of the stoves. Around him, the kitchen buzzed with urgency. Pans hissed, knives clattered, and assistants scurried like dancers in a hurried ballet. His sous chef Luis leaned close and whispered, "You all right, boss?" "You've been cutting that garnish the same way for 10 minutes. Daniel forced a smile. "Just making sure it's perfect." Luis frowned, sensing the truth behind the forced calm. He'd worked under Daniel long enough to know when his mentor was pushing himself past reason. But tonight was not the night for arguments. As the clock struck 7, Daniel paused to breathe. He thought of Charleston, of his grandmother's kitchen where he had first learned that food was not just sustenance, but memory, love, and identity. She had taught him the art of seasoning, the patience of slow cooking, the pride of feeding a family. Those lessons lived inside him, yet he had buried them beneath layers of ambition, determined to prove to the world that Southern cooking belonged in the same breath as French or Italian haute cuisine. But even as he prepared to plate the first course, he knew he was haunted. Success in New York had cost him ties with his family, a growing rift with his sister Evelyn, and countless nights sacrificed at the altar of ambition. Tonight could heal those wounds, or deepen them beyond repair. The ballroom doors were about to open, and Daniel's name would be whispered across the city. Yet in the deepest part of his mind, a quiet voice murmured that triumph never came without sacrifice. He brushed the thought aside, focused on the sizzling pan before him, and whispered, "This is it. Everything I am, right here, tonight." The feast was ready to begin, but Daniel's story had only just taken its first breath. The air in Charleston always seemed heavy with salt, drawn in from the Atlantic, and pressed into every porch beam, every street shaded by oaks, draped in Spanish moss. Daniel Hayes grew up with that air, the smell of brine and soil, of earth and ocean colliding in the humid southern heat. His childhood home sat modestly at the edge of a neighborhood, where voices carried from porch to porch, and doors stayed open in summer because no breeze would come otherwise. Inside that house, the kitchen was the heart. His grandmother, Marjorie, commanded it with hands worn from years of labor and love. She was not a woman of wealth, but she owned flavors the way some people owned land. Pots simmered with collard greens, black-eyed peas, and stews that stretched simple ingredients into feasts. "Season slow, Danny," she would say, stirring with patient rhythm. "Food isn't just what you put in a pot. It's what you put of yourself." As a boy, Daniel hovered by her side, small hands eager to chop, stir, or simply breathe in the layers of scent: garlic, onion, vinegar, smoked pork. Marjorie told him stories while she cooked, tales of her own childhood, of ancestors who had survived storms, wars, and poverty, and of how food had always been the language of survival. Daniel learned early that meals could speak what words could not. But there was another side to those early years. His father, Thomas, worked long shifts repairing ships at the docks. A quiet man hardened by fatigue, he expected discipline and stability, not dreams of flavors and recipes. "Cooking won't put food on this table," he would mutter, pushing his son toward textbooks instead of frying pans. Daniel felt the weight of those words, the pressure to fit into a mold that had nothing to do with who he wanted to be. His mother, Lorraine, tried to bridge the divide, encouraging her son's curiosity in the kitchen while reminding him to take school seriously. She worried that ambition without structure would leave him stranded, and in quiet moments she confided in Marjorie. "He's got something in him," Lorraine whispered one evening, watching Daniel knead dough with concentration far beyond his years. "I just don't know if this town will let him become what he's meant to be." By the time he was a teenager, Daniel was restless. Charleston's beauty couldn't disguise the sense that opportunities were limited. He worked part-time in a small diner downtown, scrubbing pans and chopping onions until his eyes burned, all for a few dollars. Yet he loved it, the pace, the rhythm, the urgency. Watching the line cooks move with speed and instinct lit something inside him. One day, he told a friend while stacking crates of potatoes, "I'll run a kitchen bigger than this whole place." But ambition carried its own obstacles. Money was tight, and when Daniel talked about leaving Charleston to study cooking, his father scoffed. "New York City doesn't need a boy from the South frying chicken," he said sharply. "You'll get eaten alive." Those words stayed with Daniel, fueling both anger and determination. At night, Daniel sat on the porch, listening to the cicadas hum, while dreams of tall buildings and famous kitchens danced in his mind. He didn't just want to cook, he wanted to prove something to his father, to himself, and to the world that dismissed Southern cuisine as nothing more than comfort food. He longed to elevate it, to make people taste the depth he had always known. Marjorie, sensing his turmoil, gave him quiet strength. "Remember, Danny," she told him as he prepared to leave Charleston years later, "you carry this kitchen wherever you go. Don't lose it chasing something shiny. The world may change you, but never let it take the truth from your food." Her words would echo long after he stepped onto that bus bound north, carrying nothing more than a suitcase and a fire in his chest. The journey had begun, though the path would be far harsher than he imagined. When Daniel first set foot in Manhattan, the city felt like a storm that never calmed. The streets were louder, the people faster, and the kitchens he entered were unlike anything he had ever known. Heat blasted from stoves lined in rows, knives struck cutting boards in relentless rhythm, and voices barked orders that left no space for hesitation. For a boy from Charleston, it was both terrifying and intoxicating. He started at the very bottom, scrubbing pots in a cramped kitchen on the Lower East Side. The pay was barely enough to cover a shared room in a crumbling apartment, but Daniel refused to quit. Every night, while others collapsed into sleep, he lingered to watch the line cooks. Their hands moved with precision, plating dishes that looked like art. He memorized their techniques, studying them as though his future depended on it, because it did. The transition was far from smooth. His accent marked him instantly. "Hey, country," one prep cook jeered, tossing a carrot toward him. "Hope you can cook more than fried chicken." The others laughed, and Daniel swallowed his pride, pretending the insult didn't burn. But when the chef asked for help seasoning a sauce, Daniel stepped forward and offered a taste suggestion. The chef sneered. What would a Southern boy know about beurre blanc? Daniel bit his tongue, though inside his grandmother's voice rose. Season slow, let the food speak for itself. The ridicule only pushed him harder. He volunteered for extra shifts, took on menial tasks others avoided, and stayed long enough to prove he wasn't just a passing dreamer. Over time, he began cooking small dishes for staff meals. One night, he prepared shrimp and grits, creamy and rich, laced with spices that spoke of home. The kitchen crew, skeptical at first, grew quiet after tasting. "Damn," one muttered, "this is good." It was the first time New York had given him even a sliver of respect. But acceptance was fleeting. The culinary world in Manhattan was ruthless, and respect had to be won again and again. As Daniel climbed from prep cook to line cook, he faced fierce competition. It was during this climb that he first encountered Victor Lemaire, a French-born chef already celebrated for his sophistication. Victor saw Daniel's rise as laughable. "This city is not for amateurs," he told him one evening during a charity event. "Cooking with nostalgia might charm your grandmother, but it won't earn you a place here." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Food isn't about showing off, it's about connection." Victor smirked. "Connection doesn't win Michelin stars." The exchange carved itself into Daniel's memory. From that night, Victor became more than a rival. He was a mirror of everything Daniel hated: arrogance, dismissal, the belief that culture determined worth. Yet Daniel also knew Victor's words carried danger. He needed not just passion, but mastery, if he was ever to prove himself. The years blurred into long hours, calloused hands, and scars from hot pans. Slowly, his reputation grew. He was promoted to sous chef at a midtown restaurant, where the pressure was relentless and mistakes cost more than pride. They cost opportunities. Daniel fought to maintain his voice amid a world that seemed determined to silence it. Still, every time he plated a dish, he remembered Charleston. He remembered Marjorie's advice, and though he rarely admitted it, her voice was the anchor that kept him from being lost entirely. One winter evening, as snow piled outside, Daniel stood in the kitchen alone after service. He stared at the skyline through a frosted window and whispered, "One day they'll see me." Not just as a southern boy, but as a chef who belongs here. The city did not answer, but deep inside he knew his fight had only begun. Daniel was in his office above the restaurant when the call came. The Morton family wanted to meet with him. At first he thought it was a mistake. Families like the Mortons didn't just wander into small restaurants seeking a chef. They were power, wealth, and visibility incarnate, a dynasty known for politics and philanthropy, whose gatherings were written about in glossy magazines. For them to call him meant something enormous was at stake. When he arrived at the Morton townhouse on Fifth Avenue, he was greeted by walls lined with portraits of stern ancestors and rooms where money had shaped every detail. Waiting for him in a sunlit parlor was Richard Morton, father of the bride and his wife Eleanor. Their presence filled the room in different ways, Richard with a booming voice that commanded, Eleanor with a quiet sharpness that saw through everything. "Mr. Hayes," Richard began, shaking his hand firmly, "we've heard a great deal about your work. They say you can capture the soul of Southern cooking without making it feel provincial." Daniel held his breath, recognizing both a compliment and a challenge in those words. "I believe food can tell a story," he said carefully, "and I make sure mine tells one worth remembering." Eleanor leaned forward, her gaze steady. "Our daughter's wedding is not just a celebration. It will be an event watched by half the city. We don't want anything ordinary. Can you create something extraordinary?" Daniel nodded, though his chest tightened. "Extraordinary is the only thing I offer." The meeting ended with a contract that promised not only prestige, but the opportunity of a lifetime. The wedding banquet would be his stage, the kind that could secure his legacy. He left the townhouse with a folder clutched in his hands, heart pounding with the weight of expectation. Back at the restaurant, he gathered his small team. Louise looked at him wide-eyed. "The Mortons? That's huge, Daniel, but it's also dangerous." "If anything goes wrong—" "Nothing will go wrong," Daniel cut in sharply, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "This is it, Louise. This is what I've worked for. Every long night, every insult, every scar. This is where it pays off." Maya, the pastry chef, raised an eyebrow. "And what about balance? You've been pushing yourself harder every month." "A wedding this size with that kind of pressure, it could break even the strongest." Daniel forced a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Then we won't let it break us. We'll create something that New York has never seen before." Yet when the initial excitement settled, doubt crept in. He sat alone in the restaurant after hours, the city lights glowing beyond the windows. The Mortons weren't just clients. They were critics with influence that could crown or crush him. Journalists would write about the feast, Rival chefs would attend, eager to see if the southern boy could rise to their level or fall. And he knew one rival in particular would be there, Victor Lemaire. Word travelled quickly in culinary circles, and Victor had already made snide remarks in interviews, mocking Daniel's cornbread bravado. The thought of facing him under the scrutiny of New York's elite twisted Daniel's stomach. Still, beneath the fear, ambition burned brighter. He remembered his grandmother's voice, steady and grounding. "The world may change you, but never let it take the truth from your food." Tonight, those words felt like both comfort and warning. Daniel leaned over the contract, tracing the Morton's signature with his finger. This was the chance he had craved, but it demanded everything: discipline, brilliance, and a heart strong enough to withstand the fire. He whispered into the empty room, "Extraordinary, or nothing." The promise had been made. The banquet was set, and the weight of it pressed harder with every passing day. Daniel hadn't spoken to his sister in nearly 5 years when he decided to call her. The weight of the Morton Commission had settled on his shoulders like iron, and though he told himself he was in complete control, something inside urged him toward Evelyn. She was his last living connection to the Charleston home, the one who still carried their family history in her voice. He dialed her number late at night after service, when the restaurant was dark and empty. The phone rang long enough that he almost hung up, but then her voice came through, clipped and cautious. "Daniel?" "It's me," he said, suddenly unsure of his own intention. "I thought it was time we talked." There was silence, heavy and raw. Then she asked, "Why now? 5 years of nothing, and suddenly you need my voice." Daniel gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles white. "I'm not calling because I need something. I wanted to hear you, to know how you've been." Her laugh was sharp. "How I've been? I've been carrying the weight you left behind. Mama's house, the bills, the memories. Meanwhile, I see your name in magazines. Daniel Hayes, the Southern Star of Manhattan. You left us for fame." The words pierced deeper than he expected. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but he knew she wasn't lying. "Evelyn, I didn't leave because I didn't care. I left because I couldn't breathe in Charleston anymore. I had to prove myself." "And what did it prove?" she asked quietly. "That you can feed strangers better than your own family?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and Daniel felt the ache in his chest sharpen. Memories rose, Evelyn as a teenager, keeping the house steady while he dreamed of leaving, the nights she cooked simple meals for their parents when he was gone at the diner. She had always been the one to hold things together, while he was the one who chased something bigger. "I got a commission," he said finally, his tone unsteady. "The Mortons. It's the biggest event of my career. And you're calling me to brag?" "No." His throat tightened. "I'm calling because it scares me. Because for the first time, I'm not sure I can carry it. And when I think of failure, I think of you. I think of how I failed us." Evelyn was silent again, but softer this time. He could almost picture her sitting on the porch in Charleston, the cicadas singing, her hand wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee. "You always wanted the world, Daniel," she whispered, "but you forgot the people who gave you your start. You forgot that family is the first table you ever serve." Her words were not cruel, yet they cut deeper than any insult Victor Lemaire had ever thrown his way. He swallowed hard. "Maybe I did forget, but I don't want to anymore." Evelyn exhaled slowly, the sound full of years of distance. "Don't say that unless you mean it. Pride has always been your curse. If you let it control this wedding, it'll ruin you too. Mark my words." Daniel closed his eyes, the truth of her warning pressing into him like a blade. "I'll remember," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed himself. For the first time in years, brother and sister lingered on the line together, suspended between anger and something that resembled forgiveness. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was alive with things unsaid, with wounds that would not heal overnight. But it was also alive with the faintest possibility that he wasn't completely lost. When they hung up, Daniel sat alone in the kitchen, his reflection staring back at him from the darkened window. Evelyn's warning echoed. Pride could destroy him. And as the days to the wedding drew closer, he couldn't shake the feeling that her words were not just a sister's bitterness, but a prophecy carved from truth. Daniel expected to meet Clara Morton in a crowded room with handlers and family members circling her like guards. Instead, she came alone, stepping into the quiet of his restaurant one late afternoon when the dining room was closed for service. She was younger than he expected, barely in her 20s, with auburn hair swept into a simple knot and eyes that carried both warmth and a kind of private defiance. "Chef Hayes," she asked, extending her hand. "Thank you for making time for me." Daniel wiped his palms on his apron before shaking it. "Of course, this is your wedding after all. What can I do for you?" Clara sat at one of the tables, her posture relaxed, but her tone steady. "I know my parents have given you instructions. They want grandeur, excess, a spectacle people will talk about for months, and you'll give them that. I'm sure you will. But I want something else too, something just for me." Daniel tilted his head. "Go on." She smiled faintly. "I spent summers in Savannah with my grandmother. She used to cook the kind of food that filled a house with joy: okra stew, cornbread, peach cobbler. She said food was memory, not just flavor. I want that feeling at my wedding. Not just elegance, not just plates people will photograph. I want food that tastes like love." Her words caught Daniel off guard. For a moment he saw Marjorie standing in his Charleston kitchen, stirring pots and telling him the same thing. The memory pulled at him, unsettling and comforting at once. "You want me to blend that tradition with the sophistication your parents expect?" Daniel said slowly, more to himself than to her. "Yes," Clara replied. "I want the menu to speak both languages, my family's name and the heart of my childhood. Can you do that?" Daniel leaned against the chair across from her, searching her expression for any sign of jest, but there was none. He felt both inspired and terrified. "It won't be easy. Those worlds, Southern roots and Manhattan prestige, they don't always sit comfortably on the same plate." "Then make them," Clara said softly, her eyes unwavering. "That's why I chose you." The weight of her trust pressed into him, heavier than the Mortons' expectations of grandeur. This wasn't about spectacle, this was about meaning. He wanted to rise to it, but he also felt the sharp edge of risk. Blending cuisines in a way that satisfied both sides would demand more than skill, it would demand vision. Later, in the kitchen, Daniel shared Clara's request with Luis and Maya. Luis whistled low. "She's asking you to walk a tightrope with no net. Southern food wrapped in fine dining, that's bold. It could either crown you or crush you." Maya crossed her arms. "But it's beautiful. It's the first time someone's asked you for more than perfection. She's asking you for honesty." Daniel rubbed his temples. "Honesty doesn't always sell in Manhattan. They want polish, precision, flash. If I lean too far into Southern roots, they'll laugh. If I lean too far into haute cuisine, she'll know I ignored her. Either way, I risk failure." Luis placed a hand on his shoulder. "Or you make something no one's ever seen before." Those words stayed with Daniel into the night. He walked through the city streets, the air sharp with autumn chill, and thought of Clara's eyes, her quiet defiance. She wanted a wedding feast that would tell her story. And maybe, just maybe, it was time for him to tell his own without compromise. Yet even as he dreamed of possibilities, he knew Victor Lemaire would scoff at the idea, dismissing it as rustic sentiment dressed up for polite company. That rivalry loomed like a shadow he couldn't shake. Still, Daniel whispered to himself, "Food that tastes like love." The phrase felt dangerous, but it also felt true. The week before the Morton wedding, Daniel's kitchen transformed from a place of creation into a battlefield. Deliveries arrived at dawn, crates of seafood on ice, boxes of produce stacked high, specialty spices imported at steep prices. The air smelled of citrus, butter, and stress. Every surface was occupied, every hand in motion. Daniel moved among his team like a commander. "Keep the shrimp chilled, don't let it sit. Maya, the praline glaze needs more consistency. Luis, tighten those garnishes, no shortcuts." His voice was sharp, and though the team respected him, tension bristled like static. Luis cornered him during a short break. "Daniel, you've been on edge all week. You barely sleep. We've got the skills, but you're pushing us like this is war. Daniel's jaw tightened. It is war. Do you know who's going to be in that room? Politicians, critics, chefs who've waited years to see me fail. Victor will be there, smirking, waiting for me to stumble. If we're not flawless, we're finished. Luis frowned but said nothing more, sensing that Daniel's fear had hardened into obsession. In the pastry section, Maya worked silently, her hands steady as she layered delicate cakes. She finally broke the quiet. Daniel, listen to yourself. You're turning this into something uglier than it needs to be. Clara asked you for food that feels like love. What you're giving us right now feels like punishment. Daniel froze, a knife halfway through a bundle of herbs. The words stung, but instead of admitting the truth, he snapped, "You think love wins Michelin stars? You think sentiment keeps critics from tearing us apart? No. Discipline does. Precision does." Maya shook her head, sadness in her eyes. Discipline without heart tastes empty. She went back to her work, leaving her words to hang over the kitchen like smoke. The days blurred. Daniel worked longer hours than anyone, insisting on personally tasting every dish, correcting every motion. When Luis sliced onions too thick, Daniel slammed the cutting board. "Do it again." When a new hire undercooked rice, he threw it out with a roar. "This isn't a home kitchen, it's the most important event of my life." At night, when the others had gone, Daniel stayed. He plated sample dishes, scrutinized them under the harsh light, then swept them aside in frustration. Perfection danced just out of reach, taunting him. His hands ached, his eyes burned, yet still he chased it. The stress infected the whole team. Tempers flared, arguments sparked over seasoning, timing, and presentation. One night, Luis slammed down a pan. "Enough, Daniel. We're not machines. You're burning us out." Daniel rounded on him, his voice raw. "If you can't take the heat, then leave. I'll find someone who can." The room went silent. Luis stared at him, hurt flashing across his face, before turning away. Maya stepped between them, her voice steady but firm. "Don't you see? You're already losing, Daniel. Not to Victor, not to the critics. To yourself." The words struck him harder than he wanted to admit. He opened his mouth to argue but found no reply. Instead, he retreated to his office, shutting the door against the murmurs of his team. Alone, he pressed his hands to his face, hearing his sister's voice, his grandmother's, Clara's request. They all spoke of love, of connection. Yet here he was, driving himself and everyone around him into the ground. Still pride chained him. He whispered into the dim room, "Extraordinary or nothing." And so the war in the kitchen raged on, every victory feeling hollow, every mistake echoing louder than the last. Autumn storms rolled into the city the week before the Mortons' wedding, heavy rain hammering the streets, wind rattling windows, as if the sky itself wanted to test Daniel's resolve. Trucks carrying key ingredients were delayed on highways slick with water, and suppliers called with apologies that only sharpened the edge of his frustration. One morning, Luis entered the kitchen holding a damp delivery slip. "The oysters from Maine are stuck in Boston, flooded roads. They can't guarantee arrival until the day of the wedding." Daniel's face tightened. "We'll improvise. Swap in clams, adjust the seasoning, no one will know." Luis shook his head. "That's risky. The Mortons will know. The critics will know." "Maybe we should scale back." "Scale back?" Daniel's voice rose. "This is the biggest event of my life. Do you want me to stand in front of Victor Lemaire and serve mediocrity?" Luis exhaled, weary. "I want you to serve something safe, something that won't blow up in our faces." But Daniel was already turning away, scribbling substitutions on his notepad. He convinced himself this was resilience, not recklessness. The storm outside mirrored the chaos within. A miscommunication with a supplier sent 20 pounds of spoiled poultry to the kitchen, its rancid odor filling the air. Daniel ordered it tossed, his temper flaring. "We can't afford mistakes like this," he barked, though the error hadn't been his team's. Maya approached him quietly, wiping her flour-dusted hands. "Daniel, maybe it's a sign. You're cutting corners you'd never have touched before. Improvisation is one thing, gambling with ingredients is another." He snapped before he could stop himself. "Are you questioning me, Maya?" Her eyes didn't flinch. "I'm worried about you. You're chasing perfection so hard you're blind to the cracks forming around you." Her words stung because they were true, yet Daniel shoved them aside. "I don't have time for doubt. Not yours, not mine." The staff exchanged uneasy glances, but no one pushed further. Later that night, when the kitchen emptied, Daniel walked among the counters alone. He touched the cold steel, the cutting boards scarred from years of work, the pans blackened from flame. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the drip of rain against the windows. He felt his chest tighten as though the weight of expectation pressed down, heavier with each breath. He thought of Evelyn's warning, Clara's request, and Maya's concern, but pride drowned them out. Still, cracks widened. Exhaustion crept into every movement. Luis sliced his hand while rushing through prep, the sharp blade catching him as his focus slipped. Blood spotted the cutting board, and Daniel's heart lurched. "Get it wrapped," he shouted, shoving a towel into Luis's palm. "We can't afford injuries now." Luis looked at him bitterly. "We can't afford you driving us like this either." Daniel ignored him, but the words lodged like a thorn. On the eve of the final rehearsal, another blow came. The storm knocked out power briefly, spoiling a portion of refrigerated goods. Daniel cursed, slamming his fist onto the counter. "We'll fix it. We have to fix it." Luis spoke carefully. "Sometimes things spiral out of our control. If we don't slow down, Daniel, this wedding won't just be difficult, it'll be a disaster." Daniel glared, his pride unwilling to bend. "I won't let disaster happen, not while I'm in charge." But as the storm raged and exhaustion gnawed at him, a voice deep inside whispered what he refused to say aloud. Disaster was already stirring, waiting for the right moment to strike. The morning of the Morton wedding broke clear and bright. The storm clouds swept away as if the sky wanted to mock Daniel's sleepless night. He stood in the cavernous kitchen of the ballroom, eyes gritty, hands trembling with fatigue he refused to acknowledge. The air was already thick with heat, butter melting in pans, garlic searing in oil, and the metallic clatter of knives striking boards in relentless rhythm. Luis set crates on the counter, giving Daniel a wary look. "This is it. No more rehearsals, no more corrections, just us and the guests." Daniel forced a thin smile. "Then let's make them remember us." By noon, the pressure had doubled. Wedding planners barked through headsets, florists rushed with last-minute bouquets, and waitstaff rehearsed their choreography with polished silver trays. Behind closed doors, the kitchen pulsed like a living creature, each section moving at high speed, yet barely holding together. Maya approached Daniel with a tray of delicate pastries. "These are ready for the second course." "But Daniel, look at yourself. You haven't eaten since yesterday." "I don't need food, I need focus." He brushed past her, inspecting platters of oysters that had finally arrived late the night before. He lifted one, inhaling the briny scent, convincing himself it was fresh enough. Luis caught his eye. "Are you sure about those? They were delivered hours later than promised." "If there's even a hint of spoilage—" "They're fine," Daniel snapped. "We don't have alternatives. We serve them, and we serve them perfectly." The words were meant to sound decisive, but inside, unease churned. As the afternoon waned, the ballroom filled. Guests arrived in gowns and tuxedos, their laughter rising like champagne bubbles. Politicians shook hands, journalists scribbled in notebooks, and photographers caught every shimmer of light. Clara appeared radiant, her smile genuine yet tinged with nerves Daniel recognized. Their eyes met briefly across the room, and she gave him the smallest nod as though to say, "I trust you." The first course left the kitchen. Plates gleamed as servers carried them into the hall. Daniel hovered near the pass, his chest tight, listening to the muffled hum of approval from the crowd. Relief pricked at him, but it was fleeting. The night was only beginning. Victor Lemaire appeared in the kitchen doorway, smug in his tailored suit. "So, Hayes," he drawled, "the Southern boy finally cooks for the aristocracy. Let us see if your grits can stand beside true cuisine." Daniel's blood heated, but he refused to give Victor the satisfaction of a reply. He turned back to his work, though his knife struck harder against the board than before. Course after course flowed out, each dish more elaborate than the last. The team moved like a machine wound to its breaking point. Sweat dampened collars, voices cracked with strain, but the plates kept leaving the kitchen. Still, Daniel couldn't shake the gnawing unease, the oysters, the rushed substitutions, the corners cut under pressure. He pushed the thoughts aside, telling himself that doubt was weakness. By the time the main course was prepared, exhaustion blurred his vision. He steadied himself against the counter, whispering, "Just a little longer." Luis leaned close, voice low. "Daniel, if something goes wrong, it won't just be your reputation. It'll be all of us." Daniel met his eyes, the words striking deep. Then, nothing can go wrong. The servers lifted the trays of the main course, their steps measured and precise as they disappeared into the ballroom. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing louder than the last. Beyond the gilded doors, applause rose as the dishes were unveiled. Daniel closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, willing himself to believe the night would hold. Yet a shadow lingered inside him, the quiet dread that perfection built on cracks cannot last. At first, the ballroom glowed with celebration. Silverware chimed against crystal, laughter spilled between tables, and the aroma of Daniel's creations seemed to weave through the air like music. Guests praised the presentation, cameras flashed, and Richard Morton raised his glass in satisfaction. For a fleeting moment, Daniel believed he had conquered the impossible. But as the main course settled into the room, subtle ripples of unease began to stir. A senator's wife pressed her hand to her stomach, her smile faltering as she whispered something to her husband. Across the hall, a journalist dabbed sweat from his brow, though the room was cool. In the kitchen, Daniel stood by the pass, listening for the echo of approval. Instead, a faint murmur drifted back. He frowned, straining to hear. Then a waiter burst through the door, face pale. "Chef, some guest, they're not feeling well." Daniel's chest tightened. "What do you mean, not feeling well?" "They're asking for water, looking faint. One of them, she's been sick." The words hit like a blade. Daniel's mind flashed instantly to the oysters, to the deliveries delayed by storm and desperation. He shook his head violently, refusing the thought. "No, the food was perfect, perfect." Luis approached quickly, voice urgent. "Daniel, we need to check everything. If something's spoiled—" "Nothing was spoiled," Daniel snapped, though his throat burned with doubt. "It's stress, too much champagne." "Nothing to do with us." But when the ballroom doors swung open again, the truth could no longer be ignored. The hum of celebration had shifted into chaos. Guests were rising from their seats, some clutching their stomachs, others rushing toward the exits. A woman collapsed near the head table, her cry piercing through the music. The band faltered, their notes unraveling into silence. Inside the kitchen, dread spread like fire. Maya pressed a hand to her mouth. "Oh God, Daniel, what did we do?" Daniel felt the walls close in, the kitchen suddenly suffocating. He forced himself into the ballroom, the noise hitting him like a wave. Groans, frantic voices, chairs scraping against the polished floor. Clara stood at the center, her wedding dress glowing under the chandeliers, her face stricken with disbelief as she watched guests stumble and pale. Her eyes found Daniel's, wide with both fear and trust, as though pleading for him to fix what was already spiraling beyond control. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Victor Lemaire, standing near the back with a wineglass in hand, stepped forward with a smirk masked as sympathy. Mon Dieu. What tragedy. A feast turned funeral. Who could have imagined? His voice carried just enough for nearby ears to catch. Murmurs began, whispers of blame slithering through the crowd. Daniel staggered backward, the sound of his pulse roaring in his ears. All his years of ambition, of sacrifice, of burning himself and his team toward perfection, reduced in an instant to disaster. He could see the headlines already, cruel and unforgiving. The chef who poisoned a wedding. Luis appeared at his side, gripping his arm. "Daniel, we need to act. Call emergency services, get doctors in here, anything." Daniel's voice cracked. I didn't fail them. I couldn't have. But around him, the evidence was undeniable. Guests doubled over, medics rushing in, the Mortons' reputation unraveling alongside his own. The feast, meant to crown his legacy, had transformed into a nightmare in front of the very people whose approval he had craved. Clara's voice broke through the chaos, trembling yet steady. "Daniel, can please—" He looked at her, his chest hollow, and understood that no perfection could erase this. The night was no longer his triumph. It was his ruin. Sirens screamed down Fifth Avenue as ambulances and patrol cars swarmed the Morton ballroom. Red and blue lights strobed against marble columns, painting the night with panic. Inside, guests were evacuated in waves, some clutching their stomachs, others leaning on medics for support. The scent of roses and champagne had been replaced by antiseptic and fear. Daniel stood frozen near the kitchen doors, his white coat smeared and his hands trembling. Everything blurred together, the pounding of footsteps, the cries of guests, the sharp commands of first responders. He tried to speak, but his throat locked. The weight of dozens of eyes pressed against him, suspicion rising like smoke. A detective approached, notebook in hand. "You're the head chef?" Daniel swallowed, forcing a nod. "We'll need details, suppliers, storage, prep methods. Something went wrong and we'll find out what." Louise stepped forward, trying to shield him. "We followed protocol." "Every dish was tested." The detective scribbled, unimpressed. "We'll confirm, but tonight people got sick. That means someone's responsible." His gaze lingered on Daniel before turning back to the chaos. Nearby, Richard Morton's booming voice cut through the room, angrier than Daniel had ever heard. "This was supposed to be flawless. Do you understand what you've done? My daughter's wedding is ruined. Our family humiliated before the entire city." Eleanor placed a hand on her husband's arm, her face pale. "Not now, Richard." But her eyes flickered to Daniel, filled with a cold disappointment sharper than any words. Clara, still in her gown, approached quietly. Her hands trembled as she clutched the fabric of her skirt. "Daniel," she whispered, "tell me it isn't true. Tell me you didn't know the food was bad." Her voice was softer than her father's fury, but it struck harder. Daniel's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "Clara, I swear I checked everything. I thought it was safe. I thought—" She shook her head, tears brimming. "You promised me food that tasted like love. And now all I taste is fear." With that she turned away, her figure dissolving into the chaos. Victor Lemaire lingered nearby, lips curved in a predator's smile. He spoke just loud enough for reporters to catch. "Such a tragedy. Ambition without wisdom always poisons in the end." Flashbulbs exploded as journalists swarmed, shouting questions. "Chef Hayes, how many are sick? Will you take responsibility? Was this negligence or sabotage?" Daniel shielded his face, the noise pounding in his skull. He stumbled back into the kitchen, collapsing against the counter, where hours earlier he had demanded perfection. Now the plates were overturned, sauces congealed, remnants of the feast like battlefield debris. Luis followed, his voice strained. "Daniel, we'll get through this. Maybe it wasn't the oysters. Maybe it was something else. An allergy, contamination outside our control." Daniel's laugh cracked, bitter. "Do you hear yourself? I gambled. I knew the risks, and I gambled. And now look," he gestured wildly toward the ballroom. "The greatest night of my life turned into hell." Maya entered quietly, her expression unreadable. "It was never about the food, Daniel. It was about you trying to prove something, and now you've proved it, to everyone." Her words landed heavy. Daniel lowered his head into his hands, the roar of chaos beyond the doors fading into a dull, suffocating silence. For the first time, he let the truth pierce through his pride. This wasn't just failure. This was destruction. By dawn, headlines spread across the city, the wedding that turned to tragedy, and beneath them, his name. Not as a hero, but as the chef who poisoned a dream. The days after the Morton wedding felt like years compressed into hours. Newspapers ran his name on every front page. Television anchors dissected the disaster with rehearsed sympathy, while critics sharpened their knives in print. "The chef who poisoned a celebration," one headline screamed. "Ambition served cold," another sneered. His face, once a symbol of rising success, was now plastered across screens as a cautionary tale. Daniel's restaurant emptied overnight. Reservations were cancelled in waves, investors pulled their support, and vendors who once courted his business refused his calls. The dining room sat silent, chairs stacked on tables like a stage abandoned after a failed performance. He sat at the bar late one evening, staring into a glass of bourbon he hadn't touched. The amber liquid reflected the man he no longer recognized, eyes hollow, cheeks drawn, his chef's coat draped over a stool instead of his shoulders. Luis entered quietly, setting down a folder of bills. "They're stacking up," Luis said gently. "Rent, suppliers, insurance claims. You can't ignore them forever." Daniel let out a bitter laugh. "Can't I? The whole city already thinks I'm a fraud. Maybe I'll just disappear, let them forget me." Luis's jaw tightened. "You're not a fraud, Daniel. You made mistakes, but you're not a fraud. Stop pretending you're the only one paying for this. We all worked that night. We all trusted you." The words cut deep. Daniel wanted to argue, but the truth in Luis's tone silenced him. A few nights later, Evelyn called. Her voice carried both anger and sorrow. "I saw the news, Daniel. I wish I could say I was surprised, but pride has always been your weakness. You ran from us, and now you've run straight into the wall you built yourself." He closed his eyes, her words like salt on open wounds. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "No one ever does," she replied softly. "But meaning well doesn't feed the hungry or heal the sick. You've been chasing glory while forgetting the people who needed you most." Silence hung between them until she added, "Maybe this is your chance to remember. If you don't, you'll lose more than your career. You'll lose yourself." The line clicked dead, leaving Daniel in the quiet of his apartment, staring at the cracked plaster ceiling as her words echoed. Maya came to see him the following morning. She found him sitting on the restaurant's back steps, hair unkempt, his once pristine apron wrinkled and stained. She didn't scold, didn't pity, just sat beside him with a box of pastries. "I made too many," she said simply, opening the box between them. The air filled with the sweet scent of cinnamon and sugar. "Eat one. You look like you haven't eaten in days." He hesitated before biting into a pastry. The taste was warm, familiar, almost painfully human. He swallowed hard. "I ruined everything, Maya. My name, my restaurant, Clara's wedding. I've got nothing left." She looked at him steadily. "You've got choices. That's more than nothing. You can drown in shame, or you can stand up and face what you've done. People don't remember perfection, Daniel. They remember redemption." Her words lodged deep in him. For the first time since the disaster, he felt something stir. Not hope exactly, but the faintest recognition that maybe his story wasn't finished. Still, when night fell again and the headlines screamed louder, doubt clawed at him. Could he rebuild? Could he forgive himself? Or had he crossed a line from which no one returned? The city outside glittered, indifferent to his fall, and Daniel knew he stood at a crossroads. Pride had destroyed him. What he did next would decide if anything could be rebuilt from the ruins. The invitation arrived by courier, stark and formal. At first glance, Daniel thought it was a cruel joke, a funeral notice. But when he read further, his chest tightened. The Mortons weren't burying a person, they were burying the wedding itself. A symbolic funeral, a gathering to mourn the event that had turned into public disgrace. It was a statement to the city. They would not let the scandal fester in silence. They would ritualize it, own it, and then move on. Daniel debated throwing the invitation away, but something compelled him to attend. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps punishment, or maybe deep inside a faint hope for closure. The gathering was held at a chapel in Manhattan, its Gothic arches casting shadows over the mourners. Guests arrived dressed in black, as though someone truly had died. Whispers filled the space, words like disaster, shame, and haze, blending together until they pressed into Daniel's skin. He sat in the back, his presence unnoticed at first. The air smelled of wax and lilies, heavy and suffocating. At the front, a framed photograph of Clara and her groom stood on an easel, not smiling, but solemn, chosen to fit the mood of grief. Richard Morton delivered a speech, his voice booming through the chapel. We gather not to relive humiliation, but to bury it. What should have been a celebration turned into sorrow. Tonight we put that sorrow to rest. We honor our daughter's resilience and remind the city that no failure, no betrayal, can silence the strength of this family. The word betrayal sliced through Daniel like a blade. He lowered his head, ashamed, wishing he could vanish into the pew. When the speeches ended, Clara rose. She looked fragile in her black dress, yet her voice was steady. This was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. Instead, it became a story of disappointment. But I've come to see it differently. The wedding feast collapsed, but it showed me the truth. Perfection is an illusion. Life doesn't follow menus or rehearsals. It's messy, unpredictable, sometimes bitter. Yet within that bitterness we find honesty. Her words pulled Daniel's eyes upward. Clara paused, scanning the crowd, and her gaze landed on him. For a heartbeat, silence thickened. Then she spoke directly, her tone softer. I don't hate the chef who cooked that night. He gave me what no one else dared, a reminder that love isn't about flawless presentations. It's about honesty, even in failure. Gasps rippled through the pews. Richard stiffened, clearly disapproving, but Clara didn't waver. Daniel's chest constricted. Shame and gratitude warred inside him. He wanted to stand, to speak, to apologize publicly, but his voice failed. Instead, he remained seated, hands gripping the pew until his knuckles blanched. After the service, he stepped outside into the crisp night air. The city hummed beyond the chapel gates, indifferent as ever. Clara found him there, her steps soft against the stone. You came, she said quietly. He bowed his head. I had to. I owed it to you. She studied him, her expression unreadable. You didn't owe me your presence, Daniel. You owed me honesty. And you gave me that, even if it wasn't the way I wanted. I failed you, he whispered. You failed yourself, she corrected. But failure isn't the end. It's just a beginning that looks different from the one you planned. Her forgiveness wasn't absolution. It was an opening, fragile and small, but real. For the first time since the disaster, Daniel felt the faintest stirrings of release. The funeral was not just for the wedding. It was for the man he had been, the one consumed by pride. That man was gone. What remained was uncertain, but alive. Daniel returned to Charleston in silence. The bus ride south stretched long, hours marked by blurred highways and quiet reflection. When he finally stepped off, the humid air wrapped around him like a memory. Salt clung to the breeze, mingling with the faint smell of fried food drifting from diners along the road. It was the same air he had once found suffocating, now strangely comforting. The house where he'd grown up still stood, weathered but alive. Evelyn was there on the porch, her arms crossed, her eyes carrying the weight of years. You came back, she said flatly. Daniel nodded. I didn't know where else to go. She studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside. Then start here. Life in Charleston moved slower, without the clang of Manhattan kitchens or the flashing cameras of critics. Daniel began helping at community gatherings, church suppers, and small-town events where food wasn't a performance, but a gift. He cooked with whatever ingredients people brought, okra from a neighbor's garden, shrimp fresh off the docks, peaches ripe from local orchards. The first time he set a pot of gumbo on the table, the room filled with voices, laughter, and the scrape of spoons against bowls. Children asked for seconds, elders nodded in approval, and Daniel felt something he hadn't in years. Peace. One evening, Evelyn watched him stir collards in their grandmother's old pot. You've changed, she said quietly. Daniel glanced at her, his hands steady over the simmering greens. I had to. New York broke me. No, she corrected gently. Pride broke you. New York just sped it up. He chuckled bitterly, then sighed. Maybe. But here it feels different. No critics, no rivalries. Just people eating together. That's what food has always been, Danny. You just forgot. Her words struck with the softness of truth. He remembered Marjorie's lessons, the way she stirred slow, the way she said food was more than flavor. In Charleston, those lessons returned untainted by ambition. Weeks passed and Daniel began organizing free suppers at the church hall. He taught teenagers how to season cast-iron pans, how to respect ingredients, how to cook with patience. The first time one of them recreated his grandmother's cornbread, he felt pride. Not the hollow kind, but the kind that lifted rather than crushed. One Saturday, Evelyn joined him in the kitchen. They moved side by side, her slicing tomatoes, him kneading dough. For the first time in years, their rhythm felt natural. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "New York?" He shook his head. "I miss the dream I thought I was chasing, but not the man I became chasing it." She handed him the sliced tomatoes, her eyes softening. "Maybe this is where you were meant to be all along." Later that night, after the hall emptied, Daniel sat outside under the magnolia trees. Fireflies blinked in the dark, and the air buzzed with cicadas. He breathed deeply, feeling grounded in a way he never had in Manhattan. The feast that had destroyed him no longer haunted him as failure. It lingered as a reminder of what pride could cost. But here, with simplicity, he was finding redemption plate by plate. Maya called once, checking in from New York. "How are you holding up?" she asked. "I'm cooking," Daniel said with a small smile. "Not for critics, just for people." She laughed softly. "That sounds like the Daniel Hayes I always hoped you'd be." When the call ended, he sat in the quiet, the words echoing. He wasn't the chef the city wanted, but he was finally the man his grandmother had believed he could become. Months slipped into a new rhythm, measured not by critics' deadlines or the sharp tick of New York clocks, but by the slow unfolding of community meals. Daniel found himself in places he had once dismissed as too small: church basements, backyard cookouts, school fundraisers. Yet in those places, laughter carried farther than applause ever had, and gratitude filled him more deeply than the sharpest praise of a critic. One evening, after serving stew to a line of families at the community hall, a boy tugged at his apron. "Mister, that was the best thing I ever ate." The boy's eyes shone with sincerity, his smile wide despite the patched clothes he wore. Daniel bent down, ruffling his hair. "Food tastes better when it's shared, kid, don't forget that." Walking home later, the street quiet beneath the warm glow of lampposts, Daniel thought of Manhattan. The glittering towers that had once haunted his dreams no longer pulled at him. He realized he would never be the crown chef of New York, and for the first time, he felt no shame in that truth. He had cooked for power and failed. Now he cooked for people and found peace. Evelyn sat on the porch when he arrived, a glass of sweet tea in her hand. She looked at him with something between relief and pride. "You look lighter," she said. "I am," Daniel admitted. "For the first time, I'm not carrying the weight of proving myself. I'm just cooking." She smiled faintly. "That's all Mama ever wanted for you, and all Marjorie tried to teach." Daniel nodded, the ache of memory softened by the warmth of belonging. Not long after, Clara Morton wrote him a letter. Her handwriting was neat, her tone graceful. She told him that though her wedding would forever be marked by disaster, she had moved on. She had found strength in imperfection, and oddly enough, his failure had taught her resilience. "I do not hate you," the letter read. "You showed me that life cannot be plated to perfection. It must be tasted as it comes." Daniel read the letter twice, then tucked it into a drawer. It didn't erase his guilt, but it offered something more valuable: forgiveness. One Sunday, after another community meal, Luis called from New York. "I've been hearing about you, boss. Word's getting around. They say you're feeding Charleston like no one else." Daniel chuckled softly. "Not feeding critics, just neighbors." "Maybe that's better," Luis replied. His voice carried no pity, only respect. After the call, Daniel stood in the churchyard as children chased one another between the trees. The sound reminded him of summers long gone, when his grandmother stirred pots and told him food was memory. He finally understood what she meant. Looking back, Daniel saw clearly. Ambition without humility had destroyed him, but humility without ambition had rebuilt him. He was not the same man who once believed perfection was the only legacy worth leaving. His legacy now lived in the bowls of stew, the plates of cornbread, the hands that reached for seconds, not because of elegance, but because of warmth. As twilight fell and fireflies lit the air, Daniel whispered into the night, "This is enough, more than enough." And for once, he believed it. If you followed Daniel's story to the end, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful tales of downfall, redemption, and the fragile beauty of human ambition. And if you're ready for the next journey, click on the video now appearing on your screen. You won't want to miss where it takes you.